95% of innovations fail in market. And I'm sat there thinking, guys, there's an existential threat here to innovation as it currently exists in big organizations. People say if you're not failing, often you're not pushing hard enough. But things need to fail in the process, and it needs to fail quickly and cheaply. That's the thing. You throw more money at innovation thinking you're going to get more out, and actually often the opposite happens, right? I've got limited resources. How do I be more choiceful about where I put my chips effectively, right? Where on the roulette table do I put my chips? It makes you think about risk, right? Risk and reward, upside and downside. And that's what innovation is, right?
Hey everyone, my name is Alex, and this is another episode of the Masters of Innovation podcast. Following on from GIF, or Global Innovation Forum this year, bumped into Justin in the coffee queue, and we knew immediately that there was a lot that we could talk about, and so it made sense to transition into a podcast episode. So Justin, firstly, thanks so much for taking the time.
Oh, thanks for having me. Looking forward to it.
No, absolutely. And I think innovation is the key kind of topic for both of us, where our kind of paths have crossed in that sense. We've lived it both as practitioners, but also now as more kind of advisors to big clients. So maybe tell us a little bit about yourself, for your background, and Mangrove.
Yeah, well, innovation's been core to my career for 30 plus years. Almost embarrassed to say. Started out working in big corporates, P&G, Diageo,
Sure.
Working in innovation teams. Some fun stuff, new categories, new spaces, skunk works kind of teams. Learned a lot about the tools and techniques that we still use today.
A good baseline, I imagine. Yeah.
Really good. I mean, everyone says that about P&G, right? It's like the University of Marketing and Innovation. And sort of the science and the art of innovation, I think that's key, right? All too often people think it's all about artistry. It's not. Sure. There's science to it too. And then having spent 9 years working client side, I wanted to jump to the other side of the fence and set up Mangrove with Nick, my business partner, in 2005. Initially totally focused on innovation. A more sort of commercial angle on innovation, delivering new revenue streams for big corporate clients, but also working with entrepreneurs and startups. Because big corporates are always fascinated to know what's going on in the world of startups and what they can learn and what they can steal. And along the way, we've sort of always been focused on accountability, not like most consultants where you can give advice and walk away and it doesn't go anywhere. That's fine. You still send your invoice. We were very much looking to be held accountable and having a ongoing relationship with our
How can
clients.
we partner? How can we build towards kind of common goals and common objectives?
Exactly. And part of that, demonstrating accountability, we launched our own whiskey brand when we were working for a booze company, to show that we really believed in an idea that we had. And we managed that as a bit of a happy distraction for a year or so. Actually got too popular, and we realized actually we had a really well-paid day job, so we had to go back to that.
But I guess what's interesting with that is that like so many consultancies come in, and like there is a point where you get to a point and the organization has to take it from there. And so as a pure consultancy, sometimes the challenge that is put to you is saying, well, what do you really know? Because you haven't actually gone through to actually delivering something, but you actually delivered that product in market. So this is like you as an organization have lived it, as it were.
I think we learned a lot, but it was a good case study for exactly that.
For sure.
So, having to go out and have the sales meetings, we were for the first time doing the things that our client teams are doing that we never been exposed to. So it gives you more credibility. It makes you a better advisor. And again, demonstrates that accountability.
What's cool is obviously you've come from that big business side, but you've worked with entrepreneurs, with startups, scale-ups. So you've seen like the kind of breadth of that kind of world. But we met at GIF, and we were talking about innovation from a perspective of there was some of the failure rates, which we'll get into. But innovation almost has had different life cycles, different stages and evolution. And you were talking, there's been a history there. You've been around it. You've been a practitioner. You've been working alongside. So in terms of the ages of innovation or the changes in innovation you've seen, maybe you could talk a little bit about.
A lot of change over that sort of 30 plus years. And I'd say there's probably been 3 distinct ages of innovation, and I think we're into the 4th. So the first one, when I started, was the age of ideas.
Right.
It was all about brainstorms and Post-it notes.
Design thinking, I guess, was starting to come out at that point.
And it was literally funky workshops, no holds barred ideation, get as many Post-it notes on the wall as you possibly could. and success was almost assessed by how many ideas you'd come up
Sure.
with. Now, my experience of that was nothing ever went anywhere because you weren't commercially...
Analysis paralysis kind of comes to mind a little bit in that sense.
Yeah, and I also think that out-of-the-box thinking is a totally pointless phrase, right? There's always a box.
Right.
But particularly in big business, like what you can do or should do is quite tightly defined. But back in the day, it was unconstrained thinking, and all it did was create a lot of noise and no incremental revenue. And I think there was a confusion between innovation and creativity.
Right. Okay. And those kind of lines kind of got blurred. And I guess then, like you said, there was no impact off the ideas. We can come up with loads of ideas, but the idea itself is not the real spark in innovation. Right?
Yeah, exactly. I know I've always been interested more in sort of the commercial side. Innovation is about creating new revenue streams, that are going to be there in 10, 15, 20 years' time. And there was a big disconnect at the time in the discipline of innovation, focusing very much on creativity and nothing else.
Right.
So that was the first stage.
Sure.
I'm not saying creativity is not important. It absolutely is, but it's not the...
But without impact, without drive, without commitment...
And it frustrates the hell out of senior leaders,
Yeah, 100%.
Second age was the age of process.
Right.
So I think everyone realised that we created lots of noise, but it's not going anywhere.
Sure.
And so there was a real focus on putting in place stage gate systems.
Right.
How do we get something from an opportunity area to a launch in market, and how do we do that in an efficient way?
Feels a lot more rigid than the kind of first stage.
Which was the point. But then there was like, oh, this is too rigid,
Right.
And I think a lot of companies didn't implement it in a smart way and it was almost like wearing handcuffs,
Sure.
And the people that worked in innovation felt sort of tied down by that.
I think, I've had conversations around this, and it's kind of interesting because it's, there's this kind of, I don't know, you could come up with the idea on the weekend or in the shower, and if things are too rigid, it's really difficult to give that creative juices. But at the same time, completely uncontrolled creativity, we don't actually have something tangible that we can kind of drive from, right?
Correct. And I think at the time it was a one size fits all process.
Sure.
So companies treating all ideas as equal and then put them through a really rigorous process isn't helpful.
No.
And so it slowed the whole thing down, right? That was the consequence. So then we moved into the age of speed. Right? So it's like, how do we overcome the slowness that the process is giving us? And we've seen in recent years a massive focus on corporate venturing and MVPs, becoming the key thing. But it doesn't help. Really, it's if you still got bad ideas going into the system,
you just
getting them out there quicker isn't helpful, right? So it's almost tackling a problem that shouldn't have been there rather than addressing, an opportunity that was there, which is how do we make sure we work on good things and do them well
and do them properly, right?
Yes.
And I think I've certainly heard that with AI as well as one of these kind of new technologies, is that like AI is an enabler to do things very quickly. For example, with software development, coding, building, and shipping software, but if we're climbing the wrong tree, we're just going to climb that wrong tree faster.
Correct.
And so speed as a single entity is not really the only factor that we need to kind of consider there, right?
And some things should go slowly, right?
Sure.
Because there's risk associated with them, and you need time to mitigate, understand the risk and then mitigate it, or fix issues with ideas.
Yeah.
Other stuff should go super fast if it's low risk, low return.
Makes sense.
So it was kind of, you're right, it was climbing the wrong tree. I like that.
Yeah.
And I think now we're entering the fourth age,
Sure.
which is why I thought it was worth having a conversation, because I firmly believe we're entering the age of performance and performance innovation. Because over all that time that I've been involved in innovation teams have got bigger and bigger and bigger in big organizations. The budgets being spent on innovation are getting exponentially bigger, but the ROI on that resource isn't increasing in the same way. So you've kind of got this lack of accountability and innovation not delivering over that time.
And that's a threat, right, to innovation, to the teams. And we'll get into all of that in terms of what is performance innovation, because I think that's a real key kind of context shift that you guys at Mangrove are kind of pioneering in this space. But I guess before we get into performance innovation specifically, maybe we take a step back and say, right, well, what we've looked at the past of like the journey of innovation, those kind of three ages that we've kind of alluded to. During that time, like what hasn't changed? What's been static? I mean, we were laughing because nearly every presentation at the Global Innovation Forum effectively said that every innovation team or every innovation project, like 90% failure rate. So these failure rates seem to be, and you were saying that you've seen that for a long time.
Yeah, well, when I started 30 years ago, it was like 95% of innovations fail in market.
Yeah.
And it hasn't changed, because it was a second presentation on day one of GIF, and someone mentioned the 95% failure rate. And I'm like, the elephant's just walked into the room. Is no one going to kind of
address it?
Yeah, and for 2 days, no one did.
No.
And I'm sat there thinking, guys, there's an existential threat here to innovation as it currently exists in big organizations, because it can't continue not demonstrating ROI, right? Return on investment. And that's why performance innovation for me has to be the era that we evolve into.
Yeah. I think that is one of the key points, right? Is that if innovation teams, if innovation organizations do not deliver, there is an existential threat to that whole department or that whole institution within their organization. And so there is and people do hide behind that. I think sometimes there's a little bit of a mystique of the failure rates. And I think we've both seen it with practitioners that actually, by them driving that narrative that 95% fail, it kind of gives them some air cover a little bit in terms of when things do go wrong. But
yeah, I think
things in market shouldn't fail, right?
No, exactly. Yeah. I think that's the distinction. People say if you're not failing often, you're not pushing hard enough.
Sure.
But things need to fail in the process, and it needs to fail.
Yeah.
Things that aren't going to work in market need to fail quickly and cheaply. That's the thing. So having high failure rates in your system can be the sign of having a good innovation funnel, right? It should be a funnel, not a tunnel. You should be losing ideas along the way. But getting them to market and seeing them fail is unforgivable in my mind.
Yeah. But the thing is, when we talk about those failure rates, it is about that failure in market, which is really the challenge, right?
That's the number. And it comes from, the usual suspect, BCG and McKinsey. And the associated stat that needs to go with the 95% is 94% of senior executives are unhappy with their innovation outcomes.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not like no one's seeing this. So how much longer can this 95% failure rate continue?
It doesn't feel sustainable, to be honest. And I think, we're getting to that tipping point, I think, at the moment. You talked as well a little bit about, it's the hope that kills you. And around hope, maybe do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, it was interesting. A GIF, like you, I was speaking to people in the coffee breaks and like, why are you here? And most people were saying, well, I don't know, I don't really expect too much, but if I just get one or two nuggets of inspiration, then I'm happy. And it struck me that hope was actually true at a macro level in innovation generally, right? That it's driven by hope rather than expectation.
Right.
It's a hope this will work rather than expecting something to work, because you've done due diligence on it, you've developed it well, you've done the thinking, you've used the process properly, you've aligned the organization behind it, you've done all the things you need to do. So once you hit the button on it, you expect it to succeed. And I still see in our clients, it's like, fingers crossed, this is going to work.
Which having a plan or a strategy is kind of the key, right? And I guess, let's get into performance innovation. That's the kind of mantra at Mangrove, more recently. That's the sort of stuff that you've been doing. What is this new age of innovation, and how do you see that?
It's more commercially savvy, more strategic approach to innovation, which is really focused on outcomes and accountability, right? I think innovation teams have to be accountable for the resources that they're eating up. And when you speak to good innovation managers or heads of innovation, they know that the way in which they're doing innovation isn't working.
Right.
And typically there's nowhere to hide, because the financial performance tells its own story. So driving efficiency and effectiveness by having a greater focus on return on investment, making sure that you're using resources
the right way,
so that you've got a greater chance of in-market success, but also you're operating more efficiently. So you're saving money through the process by not burning cash that you should have done. How many times have we seen that, there's projects that people are working on that everyone knows is going to fail, but because it's been worked on for 2 years, no one feels they can kill it, right?
Or it's someone's baby, and no one wants to call that baby ugly.
Yeah.
Right?
And no one's got any real sort of conviction this is going to work, and yet they live on. And it's like, well, why? That's crazy. You could be moving that resource off that project onto another idea that looks more promising.
For sure. And I think resourcing is a key one, because we were talking earlier around, where you allocate your resources is kind of key. And what's interesting in my experience is some of the kind of skunk works, smaller teams that have less money and less resources actually innovate better. And so actually having more resources and more money doesn't necessarily solve the problem, which I kind of get into that kind of performance side that you were talking about.
Yeah, I think it's almost a symptom, like it's unintended consequences, right? It's like you throw more money at innovation thinking you're going to get more out.
Yeah.
And actually often the opposite happens.
Right.
Because the teams that are resource constrained have to be more single-minded and focused, more committed to one or two things rather than less committed to a dozen things. And they have to be creative in how they use that limited resource.
Yeah.
And that often creates more disruptive outcomes that are more successful in markets. So yeah, absolutely, I think it's an unintended consequence of trying to resource up innovation.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting. I mean, from my side, 100%. I've seen that so many times with innovation projects. You see if things aren't working, we throw more money at the problem and we just back more horses. We're effectively just throwing more at the wall. Whereas those smaller teams, like you said, focus in on a subset of ideas that are really key, and you'll have less of those. Flogging a dead horse that you were talking about around projects that we all know are going to fail. When you're a smaller team with a smaller budget, you cannot afford to do that. And so that natural constraint actually can breed more innovation.
We often get asked by big businesses about entrepreneurs.
Sure.
We do work with startups and smaller businesses, and they want to know how an entrepreneur is operating. And when you ask them what they think being entrepreneurial means, they often talk about taking risks.
Sure.
And I'm like, well, there's no entrepreneur I've ever met who gets up in the morning and says, I want to go and find some risk. They are the opposite, in fact, right? They've got one idea, they've got limited resource, they need to find a creative way of taking it to market. And along the way, they'll understand the risk and mitigate for it. And that's what, big organizations need to do. And all too often, if you're working on a dozen ideas and one's not looking good, you give up on it and put your money into something else. Whereas actually, if you persevered with that idea, you may have found it was a success in market.
Sure.
So that's sort of the downside of having all the resources of a big organization behind you.
Exactly. Which is funny, and it's kind of counterintuitive, which is interesting. And I guess, right, so with performance innovation, I mean, how do we realistically achieve that? You've talked about, recognizing the problems, the first, step in that journey. I guess it feels almost like therapy, I guess, at that point.
Yeah, but I think someone needs to sort of put their hand up and say, this isn't working. This is crazy that we carry on working like this. And sometimes it's the heads of innovation who realize it or under pressure.
Sure.
Other times it's, other members of a leadership team or a CEO say, back to the 94%, I'm just not happy with what I'm getting out of it. So I think the first thing is recognizing that it's not optimal and that the way you've been doing things in the past hasn't been delivering.
Sure.
And it's crazy to expect to continue doing it. Anything's going to change. But I think linked to that is sort of a mindset shift that, going back to making choices, almost adopting the mindset of a gambler or an investor.
Right. Okay.
It's like, I've got limited resources. How do I be more choiceful about where I put my chips effectively, right?
Yeah.
Where on the roulette table do I put my chips? And thinking more like that is a real, because it makes you think about risk, right? Risk and reward, upside and downside. And that's what innovation is, right?
Yeah.
And what you're trying to do through that process of developing ideas is get a better sense of the potential upside and the potential downside and what it's going to cost you to get to that upside. And we worked a few years ago with an ex-professional gambler, a guy called Casper Berry.
Right, okay.
Who was an interesting character who had gone to Vegas to see if he could make a living just by playing poker. And his phrase was, success is inevitable, failure is inevitable, short-term failure is inevitable, but long-term success has to be compulsory, right? So you're going to lose hands along the way.
Yeah.
But you still got to win at the end of the night or by the end of the month because you've got rent to pay.
But you can't accept losing over the long term. And I guess that's the key, right?
But you've got to accept that some hands you lose, but you fold early. And and that's the fail cheap, fail quickly thing in innovation.
Yeah.
So it's quite a good, it's a mindset shift that actually turns it from that hope to, okay, let's be more savvy about how we're spending our resource. So that's, I think, the first shift that needs to happen.
I think that makes sense. And I think, thinking like a gambler or an investor, I think that's an interesting.
I think investor's probably better, right? Because gambler is still like hope.
Sure.
Because there's still stuff outside of your control as a gambler. I think it's true of an investor too, right? But I think that use of resources is thinking in that way makes a good, a change in outcomes if you can do that.
100%. And back to that resourcing thing, if we just throw money at the problem, we're just going to lose money faster, or potentially back the right horse. But it's a scattergun approach that we don't want to get into.
I think that's right, and I think if you're a gambler, you've probably got a gambling, or an investor, you've got a style, right?
Yes.
So it's either I'm going to put a big stack of chips on one thing,
sure,
or I'm going to put 2 chips on 25 things.
Yeah.
But you've got to realize the outputs of doing those 2 things are very different, right?
Yes. Yeah.
There's a very high risk strategy there, but the potential rewards are very high.
Yeah.
Versus we'll just throw a few things at the wall and see if anything sticks. And guess what? Nothing does.
But for that one big bet that the investor's making, assuming you go down that route, they're going to know everything about that one stock or that one thing, right? So you become more invested in it, which I guess is the flip side. So if you were joining a new innovation team or something like that, or one that's maybe not performing, and you were thinking, right, how am I going to build that engine? How do you build an innovation engine with this kind of performance culture?
Good question. So I think any organization has an innovation engine,
right?
And that's like everything that goes around. Everyone talks about the process.
Sure.
When people have got an issue, they normally come to us and say, guys, we think our innovation process is broken because our outcomes aren't any good. We're too slow. Nothing's hitting its target. And normally our response is, I bet it isn't the process. I bet it's something that sits around it. So we talk about the total innovation engine. And there's no one definition of the perfect innovation engine. It depends what kind of innovator you are, right?
Sure.
So the first thing you've got to decide is, am I going to be a fast follower, or an organization like a Samsung or a tech company or a pharma company where you're investing millions, if not billions, in R&D, especially the R of R&D,
sure.
Right?
Yeah.
But you're not expecting any returns for 10, 15 years. That's a very different innovation model to someone who's watching a close competitor in market.
Sure.
And then
seeing what sticks,
following but doing it better. Yeah, that's a perfectly legitimate.
I mean, Apple typically has followed that. If you talk about the tech space, I mean, there's very few product innovations that Apple has really pioneered. A lot of the big products that have done well for Apple are fast follow.
I think a lot of the guys who've done the tech, most people wouldn't know the names of those organizations, right? But Apple take it, but they overlay a great consumer experience on the front end of it. So you've got to decide what kind of innovator you are, and then you've got to create the innovation engine that's going to help you deliver that. Right? So there's no point just copying Unilever if you're working in pharma, because it's probably not going to work for you.
And it's not going to overlay.
No, but when we talk about the innovation engine, there's normally three components to it in our mind. The first one we call strategic precision, which is, have you got innovation strategy? Have you got one, but is it a good one?
Right.
Most companies we work with say they've got one, but
I mean, it's similar to AI. I mean, a lot of the clients that I work with, what's your AI strategy? And
do more of it.
So some of these one-sliders are really weak. You peel behind the curtain, and there really isn't anything there. Right.
So a lot of them will have, there's some consumer opportunity, or there's some trends, or market opportunity spaces, or whatever. But does it tell you what you're not going to do? Does it link into the business strategy? Is the organization going to get behind one of these ideas because it's fundamental to your overall business objectives? So it's got to work, right? And then once you've got one, you've got to have the right kind of resources to back it up. And, as we've already discussed, the right amount of resource, but the right kind of resource. You've got the right people, or, do you have the brands in the portfolio? You've really got to think about resources in a broader sense than just money.
Just money,
And then you kind of got two things also within strategic precision, which is portfolio management, we call it, which is going back to the moving your chips around on the roulette table, right? It's like you've got to do that in real time. You can't just let projects wander like we've already discussed and live on beyond their shelf life. You've got to dynamically be moving around your chips so that you've got a good pipeline of projects that are likely to deliver something for you.
And having the commitment or the ability to make a decision to reduce investment in a certain area and redeployment, right? Not just doing that at the end of the cycle, waiting for it to fail. That'd be we're making a decision here and we're shifting. So I guess good
decision making is built into all of that, 100%. And it's a bit, it's the stage gate process that most big companies have. Nothing wrong with the stage gate process, but the gates is where those decisions happen. But it's amazing how many times there's bad behaviors around those decisions, like project managers not being objective. They think their job's to get things through the gate rather than to present objective information to the stakeholders to say, yeah, this idea is not as big as we thought it was going to be actually.
But that also comes back to success metrics and what drives individuals. And if the goal is to just get it through the gate, you're going to do what you need to get it through the gate. Whereas rather than actually, do you know what? If this goes through or not, we're not accountable. It's not a failure that we've stopped at this gate. It's a decision that we've made that we know actually going any further, spending more resources is not the right thing to do here. Let's redeploy.
Success should be defined by 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 years after launching market, right? Is there going to be incremental revenue there? I mean, that's not, am I getting my thing through the process to the next stage and unlocking the next batch of investment? That's if that's the case, and we've seen that, by the way,
it's also too structured. It's broken, but it's too structured. I mean, back to those kind of phases of innovation where we're very much stuck in that kind of process level, which is not really where we want to be alone. So obviously the precision is key, right? Having the right strategy, making the right decisions. You mentioned as well in a previous conversation around these kind of advanced techniques. Maybe you want to talk
so
a
the
bit
second
about
bucket
that?
I'd call advanced techniques, which is really the all the nuts and bolts that make it work, right? So
for sure,
so the macro process we talked about, the stage gate needs to be fit for purpose. Usually it is, but it's often being used badly, and not flexing it for a small low risk idea versus a big breakthrough idea. So there's often some tweaking that needs to happen around the macro process. But it's bonkers if you think about it. That macro process really has nothing at the front end. You might have heard the phrase fuzzy front end,
right?
Which is like, well, where do the initial sort of ideas come from before they get into the funnel? And like no one knows, right? It's the fuzzy front end, so we don't need to define it, but you do need to define it. It doesn't need to be fuzzy, and it shouldn't be fuzzy. So, being good at around that, we had a lot at GIF, I think, around that fuzzy front end, right? From research agencies around how do we get to good insight, human-centric ideas, all that sort of stuff. Absolutely critical. But there's a structure you can put in place to do that, right? It shouldn't just be by chance or fuzzy in any way, right? It should be absolutely as structured as the rest of the process. So getting that front end working right. A number of times I've seen clients that have correctly identified big opportunity spaces, and then the ideas they come up with are tiny in comparison to the opportunity.
Well, so I mean, like, my day job is literally running workshops and design thinking methodologies and stuff like that. And sometimes we're doing these ideation sessions and we're exactly defining a really complex, a beast of an issue, and then when we're getting into the creative side of coming up with the ideas of the potential opportunities, the solutions, like sometimes they're like so specific in like a domain that would affect one person, and you're just thinking we're looking at this huge problem space, but yet a lot of the people are quite narrowly focused on what specifically affects them individually rather than taking that step back. So I think that there is an element of giving the right opportunities and having some structure around it. But I think there is a little bit of a cultural thing, which we'll get to, around like, having people the opportunity and the feeling that, I don't know, that they can come up with these ideas. I think
there's soft skills around that. That are missing a lot of companies as well, by the way. I think they were there, when I started out. Because the creativity thing attracted people with those soft skills.
Of course,
I think when I look at innovation teams now, they tend to be project managers. Right. Their skills are in how do I move my project
get it through
forward,
the gates.
Which is the middle bit of that process, right? Because the other bit in advanced techniques is what happens after launch, right? Because the stage gate process finishes with launch. You'll have a post-launch review in most stage gate processes. But actually, that's when the job really gets tough. That's when it really begins, right?
But how many times does the innovation team just walk away at that point?
And often it's given to another team. That's part of the problem. It's like, well, you're the market team, you go and execute. And often the stage gate's focused on creating the thing rather than how you're going to take the thing to market, which could be even bigger. If you think about the iPod, back in the day, people think, it shows how old I am. People used to say, we're looking for the next iPod. And it's like, well, what does that mean? The real thing was iTunes, not the iPod, right? Because Sony had the MP3 player market all wrapped up. The real unlock for the iPod was the go to market, was the route to market. It totally changed how people bought music. Now, if you put that through a conventional stage gate process, you'd have put all your effort on the dial of the iPod and what the menu looks like, and you wouldn't have thought about the go to market stuff until the very end. But it's too late. Because that's got to be built in from the beginning.
100%.
So it gets really tricky when you're in market because you're at the perils of the open market, right? And the competitors and real live consumers, customers. But we call that nurture. That nurture phase
Right.
is critical. And almost like you can create stages in that nurture stage, just like you would do in a stage gate process.
Right.
So like what happens for the first 6 months?
Yeah.
Well, we need to drive awareness. We need to educate people. We just need to get out there. Then we need to drive scale. Then it's so breaking that down, almost extending your stage gate or bolting something else into it so that it goes
Product
into
launch
market
is not the
2
end.
years. Think 2-3 years ahead. But also that's critical because you've got to be thinking about what's the investment plan that goes with it.
Yeah.
So many of that 95% failure rate, so much of that is driven by wrong expectations.
Right.
Big organizations thinking, right, we're going to chuck some money at that launch. We're going to do a big TV campaign.
Yep.
And then within 6 months, it'll be flying. And then within 12 months, it'll pay back. In fact, that's what you've got to deliver. 12-month payback.
But then all your money and your budget is up front, right? So there's no ongoing support past that. So you've got this big Super Bowl advert and then, expecting just,
and often those ideas require behavior change, in consumer. That takes time. So you've almost spent your money at the point when it's least sensible to spend the money, right?
Yeah.
Because you've got to wait.
Yeah.
Some things you've got to wait for, and that patience, I think, is a big issue for big organizations.
Yeah.
But understanding that this idea is going to take 3 years before it hits takeoff, you need to flag that early doors, and then you decide whether you're going to work on it or not. Because
for sure,
if you're not going to have the patience, don't work on those things. Yeah. If you want something that's going to pay back in a year, then do your flavor extensions or here's a new color, or whatever it is.
Well, this is it. And I guess if you're going to make a really big splash on a new idea that requires user change or a consumer change, that's something that's going to take time. So that's interesting as well, that when you're picking the idea or picking the horse that you're going to back, if you're not going to give it that in-market support, then you actually, your opportunity space is much more diminished because realistically to win in that space, we're making a slightly different color change or, we're not actually completely reinventing because if we're not going to support that, it's realistically going to fail anyways.
But better to know that up front, right?
Yeah.
And that should be part of your strategy, and making sure your portfolio of projects is right for you.
Makes sense. Yeah.
And that the fourth thing under advanced techniques is measurement and metrics, right?
Right.
So you've got to know what the right measurement
data driven
and when to measure, right?
Sure.
So there's no point in measuring the success of something after 6 months if it's going to be a long-term behavior change, or you need social proof, like EVs, good example. It's going to be small for a long time.
Yeah.
So don't try and measure the success of it after 6 months. It's probably 10 years in that case, right? So
I've seen that a million times where, I think the problem is, especially when something hits market, ultimately there's different members and different senior leaders that get involved and effectively just looking at it through an Excel spreadsheet and looking at it as a line item. And especially when the CFO gets involved, it becomes a real challenge because you're constantly having to fight then to be like, well, I know financially this is not making sense right now, but if we continue to back it, but you've got to have that long-term view. And I think there is a challenge sometimes within organizations to get that visibility. And then I remember as well, one of the other things that you talked about in terms of the innovation engine was this performance booster. What's a performance booster?
Yeah, sounds good, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
That's the third bucket. Yeah, that's the third component of the innovation engine. And there's a few things in there. I think the first one is specialist capabilities.
Right.
I think one of the other changes I've seen in the last 30 years is almost a drain of those specialist capabilities in innovation teams. As I say, the innovation managers have become project managers, but actually a good innovation manager needs a whole breadth of skills, right? You've got to be strategic, you've got to be commercial, you've got to be creative, you've got to run a project well, you've got to be able to massage the organization, So having specialist capabilities, insight, massively undervalued. I say that because I used to work in insight.
What do you mean by insight?
So having someone who can actually be the voice of the consumer throughout the whole process, right? And when I was in consumer insight many, many moons ago, one of our jobs was to do the size of prize stuff, right? So you do your consumer testing, not just to work out whether it's color A or color B, is it this cap or this feature or this feature. It was to work out how big we think this thing is going to be and validating that as best you can, right? The reason I love innovation is it's full of uncertainty, right? And you've got to be comfortable with that and make the best of it. And so a good consumer insight person is not just good at finding the insights, looking at the trends, helping in the creative process,
but being able to opportunity size. What is the and I think it's such a nebulous thing that it's really difficult. But I guess if you have the right people, the right processes around that can be massive. Because that will ultimately, back to the resources, like how much money should we putting into this over what period of time?
Back to the results, back to the decision making, right?
Yeah.
You're asking stakeholders, right, who haven't seen this project for 6 months, right? You've been away working on this thing, doing research. Come back to the stakeholders, they haven't seen it, and then you're asking to make an investment decision to whether to go to the next stage or whether to launch it. And you're presenting them with, it's going to be this big. We've done these, and here's the calculator. And it's like no one can interrogate that. So you need to know that someone on that innovation team is 100% objective.
Has done their due diligence on it.
And often, back in the day, it was like the consumer insight person would buddy up with the finance person. And those two people would actually be the objective arbiters of truth, if you like, around how big a thing's going to be. Because at the end of the day, you're not trying to pull the wool over the eyes of the organization. What you're trying to do is allow the organization to make the right decision and back the right horse, right?
Yeah. But back to the project manager kind of mentality, if the end goal is to just get through the stage gates, then
it drives the wrong behavior. What you get into is a sell behavior at those gate meetings, right? I'm selling you this project.
Yeah.
So I'm going to massage my numbers. And often the stakeholders are to blame because they might say, well,
if it's not over this amount,
it needs to happen. There's a hurdle rate. There's a hurdle rate, right? We'll go back and work on it, and then suddenly the number goes up. It's like, well, how did the number go up? Right? But no one feels equipped to challenge, right? So you need someone who's going to put their hand up and say.
No, the amount of times I've seen that is just like, what's the opportunity size that we need to get, to get approved? It's like, well, we don't even think about anything less than 50 million or something like that, and then the brief comes in at 51 million, or it's really true. Like I definitely see that, and it's like these kind of subtle, trying to suss each other out before the meeting, just to make sure
for
that
whose benefit though, right? You've got to understand you're working for the same company at the end of the day. It doesn't feel like it often in big organizations. I think linked to that, another performance booster is sort of your organizational structure and linkages.
Right.
So it's really hard, what's the right structure to have around innovation? Should it be sitting outside on its own, totally autonomous, so you can dream and have the freedom to experiment and explore possibilities, or should it be closer into the rest of the organization so it's hardwired into the current business and brand strategies?
In my opinion, the second feels like the right thing. I guess each organization is unique though, right?
And depends on the kind of innovation, right? So if you are doing breakthrough innovation, give it more space. If you're doing line extensions on existing brands,
be more embedded.
Bring it in. So it may have to exist in different spaces in the organization, right? But regardless, it's very easy to sort of have a nice, entrepreneurial spirit and innovation team. But there always comes a point where it has to interface with the rest of the organization, right? You need the supply chain director to work out a way of making this thing, or you need the commercial director to put this alongside the other stuff the sales guys need to sell. So being able to massage the organization, having the right linkages, making sure that, there's those friction points that are inevitable are minimized is critical. Otherwise you end up with this irrelevant team that just kind of sit on the edge of the business and don't do anything.
How many innovation teams have we seen where literally, they're just like the ones that play with toys, and like it's funny actually. Some of the conversations that I have, it's like, as a technology vendor, like in my role at Microsoft, like sometimes you have a hesitance to engage with some innovation teams because in a lot of cases it's playing around with toys, and that's a bad reputation. They're not driven by business impact and things that they're trying to achieve, and I think it comes back to that culture, right? And I think having the team embedded in the way that makes sense for what they're wanting to achieve. I really like that framing that you've talked about, is that like if we're breaking through, actually being slightly outside of the organization makes sense. I guess the question is the key is if they are slightly aside, that when we get an idea and we've gone through those stage gates and we are ready to bring it into the organization, that we have, the right framing, the right kind of, structures around that for success,
and often
right?
It can be as simple as just having the right stakeholders involved early on in the process.
Right. So they're not caught off guard, I guess.
Exactly. And then you do have to get into you're trying to get the sales director who, I'm not picking on sales teams, right? They tend to have a shorter horizon, right? They think about the next quarter or the next sales window, So if they see something last minute that blindsides them, it's like, of course they're going to be resistant to
and
it.
Especially from a breakthrough innovation team, because it could just completely disrupt their entire business.
But if they're decision makers on the stuff they're doing right up front and say, guys, I'm on board, good luck, go away and come back when you're ready, it makes it a lot easier, right? So simple fixes. The other thing that I think is really key, which sort of touched on this, is performance culture. Right? So the other performance booster is just making sure the culture's right. You've got to have accountability in the team. going back to the point you made about the mystique around failure.
Sure. Yeah.
There's got to be some consequence, right? Now,
Yeah.
it isn't necessarily about your ability to get an idea through. Sometimes you're just given a project that isn't very good, right?
Yeah.
As a project manager, I've been given a terrible idea, but what your job should be is to learn about that idea as fully as you possibly can, and present the evidence to the stakeholders so they can make a decision whether to launch
an
it
objective
or not.
decision
An
based on
objective
facts,
decision.
based on the key information.
And if you're doing that properly and your whole engine is set up, then that's good. That's good accountability. That's kind of how you should judge performance, not on whether you get something through the next gate meeting or not.
For sure.
So that's sort of the other thing in performance is having that learning environment, learning culture, as well as performance culture. It's like you come in to learn about things. The best I've ever seen is when I was at P&G. You were told that as an innovation team, multifunctional innovation team, your job is to create great learning.
Yeah.
And I remember working on a project that we'd sunk millions into it for like 2 years. I think it had even gone to a in-market test market, which cost God knows how many million, and ran for 6 months, and at the end of the 6 months, it was my job to crunch the numbers and say,
this is
sales aren't high enough, guys. It's not it doesn't meet the hurdle rate. We can't make money out of this, or we've got better ideas. Then having the courage to say, okay, then great.
Yeah.
Guys, you did a great job. You did a great job, because what you've done is you've allowed me as the CEO or GM to say, we're going to kill that. We're not going to launch it. If we'd launched it, I'd have signed off X million on ad campaign, in market support over a period of time, and then we'd have pulled it in a year, 2 years time anyway, and we'd have lost face with the retailers or the.
But also, the opportunity cost is lost, right? About the other idea that could have been the one that made it, and I think this comes back to the culture. Maybe we'll talk about culture now. Is that having that right attitude and approach? I think as a practitioner in the past around innovation within an organization, like, sometimes going to be a bit tiring being that single voice pushing through. I mean, how do you drive for innovation? Like, how do you build a performance culture within an organization?
I mean, it's something we've always been interested in, Mangrove. Nick and I wrote a book years ago called Stretchonomics, which was all about trying to understand the drivers of repeated success, whether it's in sports teams or individuals or entrepreneurs and corporate environments. And we got really interested in how sort of some of these smaller scale-up businesses, the cultures they have. And you think, when you work in the big guys, you're like, you really need to learn from these guys. That's kind of what you should be capturing. And we call it challenger culture. There's a load of good stuff written about challenger brands. I think Adam Morgan, isn't it, I think. But we were interested in the organization that sits behind it, and we found there's like 7 drivers of a good challenger culture. And you kind of need to embrace those, I think. And in innovation in particular, you really benefit, I think, if you can have that challenger mindset, challenger culture.
It is a challenge as a large multinational, though, especially if you're the market leader. Because I think some of the conversations I've had with the likes of Unilever, Procter Gamble, some of these names, there is a hesitancy to mess with the things that work too much, right? And so there is how do you balance that? Have that challenger mentality, but also, as the market leader, it's always a little bit different, right, compared to a startup.
Yeah, it is. And I think if you're a market leader, your typical mindset is one of protection. Right?
Yep.
It's like a market leader in these categories. My job, is to
maintain,
not lose share. That's what you're looking at on a monthly basis. Have I lost market share or not? Whereas in an innovation team, you're looking to open up new revenue streams.
Sure. Yeah.
So you're not going to change the culture of the total organization, but you do need to create your own space and your own challenger culture. And then you've got to and it's too highbrow, right? How do you change a culture? It's one of those ethereal things, isn't it? But we're very pragmatic about it. You pick the 5 or 6 behaviors that you really want to change, that really start to shift the needle. And then once you've done that, you need to keep every individual accountable, right? So we've been working recently with an elite sports person who's now moving into the world of business and working with us. Right. Which is, how do we take the lens of elite sport, right? Because they're very good at creating good cultures, winning cultures. That are inclusive, they create team spirit, it's not sort of too hard-nosed. It would work in a corporate environment.
And they're tested regularly, right? Every race or
so
game.
Right, in a corporate, you have your annual review. If you're lucky, you might get a 6 month in the pub, let's do,
You're doing all right. You're not getting fired.
We'll catch up in the pub after that meeting at the agency. It's okay, do a bit more of this, bit less of that. It's nonsense, right?
Yeah,
because think of the missed opportunity, the opportunity cost of not coaching someone or making an intervention. If you see, they're not delivering those behaviors you've identified, or they're not hitting the targets you've given to them.
Yeah.
So imagine, Arsenal or Tottenham, having a match on a Saturday, Monday morning, they're picking apart the video analysis, and every member of the team or squad's getting feedback, right? And that is being worked on then for the next weekend's game. Like, why would you not do that? Why do we not do that?
And I think in the corporate world, like you said, we are, very much, and a lot of companies as well, especially with sales cycles, are fiscal year driven, and so everything's in year. But the thing is, a lot of the time there's not enough done during the year to really affect major change that's going to change the outcome.
And everyone's lost out, right? The business has lost out on potential performance gains because the team aren't delivering the behaviors that you've identified as being really important to better innovation performance. But the individuals lose out as well, right? The individuals lose out on that development opportunity and being coached. And I think it's always a bit of an afterthought. I mean, it's a broad brush statement, right? But in most corporates that I've dealt with, it's kind of like it's always secondary to business.
We have to do that, like as part of the process. But like, are we really learning from it? Also, even in that annual situation, like yes, we're doing that at annual, but are we doing anything after that? Are there any interventions that are actually happening? I think this is to your point, is that we need to have these more regular kind of check-ins, or at least just kind of nudges in the right direction. That is much more productive than an end of year. But even at an end of year, like, if we don't do anything past that, it's kind of a waste of time.
So in our business, every one of our people, we've identified what our 5 or 6 metrics are, the behaviors we expect people to display, and everyone is rated weekly.
Right.
So people rate themselves, and as leaders of the business, we rate them.
Yeah.
And actually looking for the discrepancies is like really insightful. It's like, well, you thought you were doing a bad job there. I actually think you're doing a really good job there. Why is that? And then if you're doing that, then you can work out, is a coaching intervention needed? And if so, what is it? And you can do it real time, rather than waiting until the end of the year and saying, I'm going to sign you up for that course on leadership.
It's also a lot more productive. And I think it breeds a kind of transparency that, like, I understand where I'm at. So I think sometimes in these annual reviews, like, you might have thought you've done really well that year, and then actually they're telling you that you haven't. And then or vice versa.
You can't have a performance culture if you haven't defined what performance means.
Yeah.
And individuals don't know whether they're performing or not. Right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So
you should know as an individual, if you've signed up to that and you have this kind of regular check-ins, whether you're doing well or not.
Yeah, and then so then when you get to the end of the week, you know whether you've had a good week or a bad week, right?
Yeah. No, I like that.
So it's much more rewarding place to work, and it's not a difficult thing for big companies to do.
For sure. No, it makes sense.
And I think it has the biggest impact in innovation teams.
No, for sure. And I guess and with innovation being so nebulous, having those kind of regular check-ins really kind of key. So I mean, Mangrove, obviously, Justin, you founded it a few years ago. Like, what? How can you guys help? What are the sorts of things that you do? With these like big corporates all the way through to entrepreneurs and stuff. What are the sorts of things that you guys can help with? Yeah,
we do a lot of going in and looking at that innovation engine we just spoke about, and we call it remapping it. Innovation remap, right? So it's not about rebuilding it, because no one wants to hear that, right? No. If you go in and say everything's broken, super unhelpful and actually not needed. What we found over the years, if you go in and do a diagnostic that say, there's 1 or 2 things here that aren't working as well as they should be. And often, actually, you see a symptom over here, but the cause is over here. That's why I said to you earlier, people say, well, our process is broken. And we're like, actually, probably not the process.
Peel back a few layers.
It's because your strategy isn't right. So people can't judge ideas because you don't know what they're judging the ideas against. So the decision making is breaking down. Actually, all these things are connected, but it's not the process. It's these other things. So actually, if we just go and make these fixes over here, you'll find the whole thing works a lot better. So a lot of what we do now is going in and doing that diagnosis, benchmarking with best practice, right? It's one thing to tell someone, hey, you're no good at this.
Yeah.
The next question is, well, what does good look like, right?
Yes.
And so because we've got 30 years experience, we've kind of got lots of good best practice examples of how you do all those different components of the innovation engine, what good looks like.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess you've got to diagnose the problem, but also there's potential like benchmarking that you can do. I mean, I'm interested to get like, are there any client examples that, that come to mind that, you wanted to maybe share about? Yeah,
we've recently done one of these innovation remaps with a big multinational food business.
Right.
And it was exactly that. It's you do the debrief of like, this is broken, or this isn't working right. And everyone in the leadership team sort of nods.
Yeah.
Because people, if if you're a good business, you should know, right?
Yeah.
But sometimes you need someone from the outside to come in and say,
yeah. I think sometimes a lot of time when you bring consultancies in, it's almost like a validation. Like I've acknowledged that there's something's not right, but I want someone else to tell me that.
There's value in that, right?
100%.
I mean, I would say that, but I think there is. I think there is value in that, but you then need to go on and say, why is that happening?
Exactly. Yeah.
But also, bring the benchmarks in. So
sure.
yeah, but we've worked at an organisation or we've seen another company, and they do it in this way, and use that as inspiration. Not to say copy them, because going back to what kind of innovator you are, you need to make sure you're taking the learnings from the right kind of business. If you go and look at the amount of R&D spend that a farmer, it's pointless trying to make that comparison. So cherry picking the examples, it gives people hope, and a sense of, I can see just by changing that slightly, then actually we can make a big difference.
For sure. I think that makes definitely a big impact. I think as well, seeing it in a wider sense, taking a step back. I think sometimes when you're embedded in an organization for a long period of time, you become accustomed to the way that we do things, and there may be you may have stopped asking the question about why we do things. And I think having someone else in to help
it's a really good point. And you almost hear people say that. It's like, because you ask them, they're working on these projects, no one's got any conviction or any belief, and it's like, well, so why are you still working on it? They sort of look at their shoes, and it's like, don't know really, but we're just sort of so caught up in the motions of pushing these projects forward. They haven't got time to step back.
And that is a big problem with innovation. Typically, from what I've seen, is it's the time thing. You talking about having the idea to the space to come up with new ideas, but there's also the space of the learning and development that you talked about. Space means time, and if we're too busy delivering. This comes back to that resourcing thing again, but from the human factor, if we're just if our entire diary is stacked with existing projects, how are we going to come up with new ones? How are we going to think about things differently? We're so stuck in the process.
Well, I think going back to where we started on those ages of innovation, right, and the age of creativity, everyone had time, right, to dream. Maybe too much time, right?
Sure.
Arguably. But now, the age of speed, the unintended consequences of that means that all the innovation project managers we work with, they look stressed, man.
For sure.
They're working on too many things with unrealistic timelines. And it's like, well, do fewer things.
And do them better, focused.
But do more work on that one, less work on that one, because the risk versus reward profile is different. So if you've got that risk reward sort of gambling mentality.
Back to those kind of chips on the board. I think it makes sense. And also you talked about, you brought up a couple of times that sometimes actually, with a remap, it's not a complete throwing it away. So actually sometimes just little minor interventions can make a big difference. You talked about there was another client you were working with where that actually really kind of came through,
a big alcoholic beverage company. Same thing. They were in a situation where they were just working on too many small things and wanted to make a step change to do fewer, bigger, better things. And by doing this remap, we just found 3 or 4 small interventions, and it had a big impact on outcomes.
Sure.
So no one wants to hear you need to rip this up and start again, right? And that's why it's not a rebuild. It's definitely a remap. By pushing on the right levers. So you and I think the frustration, not frustrating for us because it's good business, but the surprising thing is that people don't sort of recognize what these levers are. Partly because they're too head down in the detail, but it's not like we don't know how to move into the era of performance innovation, right? The things I've just gone through isn't rocket science.
No.
And if innovators have been around long enough, they know what the levers are, the things need to change.
It's not just the levers; it's also having the confidence and the drive yourself to stop and say, is this the right thing? And actually, this is one of the big things with being a practitioner of innovation is that it can be quite tiring at times. You're forcing change. You're saying no a lot, or you're going against the grain. It's very easy in a meeting to kind of all agree, nod, and move on. But to really drive innovation, sometimes you have to be that disruptive voice, which feels difficult, but is the right thing to do. And I think that's
and I think at its core, I totally see that. See that all the time. At its core is you're comparing certainty with uncertainty, right? So, when innovation hits the core business or an innovation project's being assessed versus where else you could spend your resources on, brands or R&D or whatever, you've got uncertainty in the world of innovation, but I know my bang for buck or my return on investment. If I put an extra $1 million into advertising, I kind of know what I'm going to get back. Right?
Sure.
So it's kind of unfair.
Yeah.
And also you've got the fact that the antibodies of the organization are there to almost kill things that are different and disruptive and that don't, go down the rails of the existing business.
Yeah.
So that's what you're fighting against the whole time.
Constantly.
So you need resilience, right? You need resilience. And often we see in project managers we work with endurance, which is different, right? So resilience is adrenaline driven. I'm up for this. This is difficult and challenging, but
we're going to get through.
I know why I'm doing it.
Yeah.
I've got a really good strategy. I buy into the why of the strategy, which is really important. I feel motivated, and I know that I'm going to be supported, and I'm learning and I'm
Sure.
That's a good positive, that's how you drive resilience, and it's driven by adrenaline effectively. Endurance is what we see a lot, which is survival, right? I just need to get to the end of the week or get to my next gate meeting. I need to keep these plates spinning, and I've got too many things and I don't believe in them, and I know I'm making a compromise here. Death of 1,000 cuts, this idea is getting worse and worse, but I haven't got time for that conversation, and it's like, it's endurance. It's about survival, right? And it's driven by cortisol, the stress hormone, and it's different. And I'm seeing more and more of that.
Right.
And I don't think it needs to be the case, right?
No.
By taking a step back, making some of these tweaks, fixing the engine, fixing the culture around it, you can actually enable these people who are good people, right?
Yeah.
Good people, and help them move out of this place where it's all about hope and shift it back into the world of expectation, right?
So closing thoughts, where do we go from here? Performance innovation feels like almost like, based on what I've heard, like a non-negotiable for innovation teams going forward. I mean, how do you see that?
Well, it goes back to what we talked earlier. I think it's an existential threat for innovation in big companies in its current guise.
Yeah.
So, the pressure on innovation is more than ever. We still need to deliver big results, big growth numbers. Sustainability is coming in and putting more pressure on innovation teams because they've got another set of deliverables to think about.
And another set of parameters that, overlay over everything, right?
Which often conflict, right? Yeah. Growth and footprint often go against each other. There's, most companies are resource constrained at the moment, right? So it's not like there's going to be more money, and not that there should be, right? Because as we said earlier,
it's not necessarily a blessing and a curse, right?
Yeah, exactly. Limiting resource actually might be a blessing for some organizations, but those 95% failure rates can't be there for another 30 years, right? So
I think if they are, I think we're gonna struggle. I think you're gonna find a lot of, we're talking about the resource constraints. They're only going to get worse as senior leaders look at that 95%. They're just going to give up.
Yeah, right. But I think by adopting the performance innovation principles, making sure your innovation engine is fit for purpose, at least allows you to increase your chances of in-market success, right? And also drive efficiency. So maybe you can do more with less, right? If you actually fully embrace these principles. Yeah. And I think, it's for the heads of innovation to sort of lean into this. It's better if you do it yourself rather than have it done to you, I always think.
For sure. Yeah. Take the lead, be
proactive.
Yeah. Be
so
proactive.
This isn't good enough.
Yeah. But like you said, earlier, diagnose the problem, look at that, be honest. But then, you'll be able to drive that innovation culture. So yeah, Justin, thank you so much for the great conversation.
Pleasure.